I'm Peter Klein, and I want to talk to you today about the economic theory of the firm. Most economic activity takes place in business firms, so you might expect that economists would have a lot to say about firms, where they come from, how they're organized, why they do what they do. Yet surprisingly, while economics has been a scientific discipline for more than 200 years, it's only fairly recently that economists have begun to think systematically about how to analyze the business firm. The seminal article in this field was written by a young British economist named Ronald Coase, published in 1937. And Coase's article, while it became quite well known, unfortunately was not used to develop a systematic theory of the firm until much later, around the 1970s. Before Coase's paper, economists focused mainly on the economic system as a whole, trying to understand better Adam Smith's famous notion of the invisible hand. So, for example, asking under what conditions do certain kinds of desirable or efficient outcomes obtain? What are the effects of monopoly and other anomalies in the market system? More generally, they focused on explaining prices and outputs. Coase, as a young man, had visited the United States in the 1920s as a student and been to a number of industrial manufacturing plants, such as the Ford Motor Company. And Coase was struck by their size and their relative centralization. As he put it in his article, the large business firm appears as an island of socialism amidst the giant sea of the market. And this led Coase to ask the following questions. First, why do we have these islands of socialism in the market? In other words, why do large hierarchical firms exist in a market setting? Second, what determines the boundaries of these firms? How large can they be? How large should they be? And third, if organizing activity inside the firm is so great, why isn't all production carried out inside one giant firm? And he theorized that the answers to these questions must relate to what Coase called transaction costs, or the costs of exchange. So he had in mind the following: when doing business in the marketplace, when individuals and firms are doing business with other individuals and firms, they have to find people to trade with, they have to discover the relevant prices, they have to negotiate, maybe write contracts, they have to resolve disputes, and all of these activities involve some costs. There is time, legal expense, the economic cost of engaging in haggling and negotiating, and so forth. And Coase theorized that by organizing activities inside a firm with central coordination by an entrepreneur or a manager, it may be possible to economize on these costs of exchange or transaction costs. So key to Coase's theory was the idea that inside a firm, resources are allocated by administration, by the direction and control of the entrepreneur or entrepreneurs. Now, presumably, directing individuals inside a firm has some costs associated with it as well, some administrative costs or managerial costs, and these help to explain the limits to the firm. In other words, according to Coase, marginal analysis results in the optimum level of planning in a market economy, by which he meant the entrepreneur can balance on the margin the costs of exchange on the marketplace, costs avoided by internalizing activities, against the costs of managing people inside a firm. And by balancing these at the margin, one can arrive at firms that are just the right size. Now, several decades later, in the 1970s and 1980s, other scholars began to elaborate, make more explicit, and develop Coase's insights. For example, scholars such as Oliver Williamson and Benjamin Klein developed a theory of the circumstances under which transaction costs of exchange in the market will be very high. In particular, they argued that these costs of exchange may be prohibitive when trading partners choose to invest in assets that are co-specialized. In other words, assets the value of which depends on a particular contractual relationship ongoing. The idea being, once those assets are in place, trading partners may have an incentive to threaten to walk away or terminate the relationship unless they get a larger share of the joint value. And worries over this kind of haggling over the returns to co-specialized investments may make parties reluctant to invest in such assets unless they're protected by some kind of a detailed contract or maybe common ownership, in other words, vertical integration. Other scholars, such as Oliver Hart, formalized the notion of ownership and managerial control, making Coase's notion of fiat a little bit more precise. So the key question in this approach asks, what assets should be owned by which individuals or which groups of individuals? So proprietorships exist when one individual owns a small set of assets. One individual may own a larger set of assets, or groups of individuals may choose to own assets jointly. Now, there are some critics of these kinds of approaches who have, for example, argued that fiat is overstated, that the firm is more like what Armin Alshin and Harold Dempseth called a nexus of contracts. Coase and Oliver Williamson and others have responded that this is true. Firms are voluntary. There's certainly no Marxist exploitation aspect to the firm. But employment contracts are different from other kinds of contracts. They're more open-ended. Courts typically are reluctant to intervene in disputes over the nature of employment contracts. So there really is something different about activities inside a firm and activities outside a firm. In short, the theory of the firm, or what's more commonly called organizational economics, is a well-established and growing field within economics. It's complementary to literatures in business strategy and organizational sociology and psychology, business history, and so on, which provide very detailed case studies of particular firms and industries. The modern theory of the firm has generated a large stream of quantitative as well as qualitative, and this has generated many additional insights into what firms do and how they do it.